Hi, and welcome to Reflections in Veterinary Education. I am Bobby Connor, and I am joined I have with me Catherine Fogelberg and Eric Hoffmeister. As always, this is the team for Rive, and this episode is going to be a journal review. And Catherine, I think you're going to be leading this one for us, right? You chose the article this time.
Yes, thank you. So I apologize for my voice and my occasional sniffs. I have a cold, but we will try to get through this.
Luckily, we're all remote, so it's safe for everybody.
Yes, exactly. At least I'm not wearing a mask too. So yeah, I chose an article tonight because for anybody out there listening that knows me at all, they know I'm a qualitative researcher, and I know that that's something that is sometimes difficult for veterinarians to grasp in terms of what that means. And that in combination with doing educational research, I think is something that's always a good thing to talk about. So I selected, it's a pretty brief article, but it's basically an article that talks about the importance of using qualitative research in veterinary science, and provides some introductory concepts about qualitative research, which are fairly basic, but I think the author did a pretty nice job of introducing that information. So I guess the first thing I wanted to do was maybe just ask Eric and Bobby what your experiences with qualitative research were, and get some background from you all before we get started on the paper.
Before we even talk about the paper, do you want to say what? Okay, all right.
I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, we need a reflexivity statement to start this discussion.
Well, there you go.
All right, you're up, Eric.
I can't remember when I first encountered it, but when I was doing my master's in sport pedagogy, one of the electives, we actually had a qual certificate that you could get at UGA if you did like 4 courses. I only took the intro to qual. So I took that course and I was like, this is amazing. There's all this stuff about the concept of science that I did not know, and that frankly, most PhD researchers have not a clue about.
Yeah.
So I was like, this is busted. Our whole system is busted. And then I've done a number, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 projects that have had a either wholly qual or have a very significant qual component to it without being mixed, because mixed is a whole different thing. So I have a bit of experiential practice with it, with not that much formal training / education. And I'm sure if, you know, a serious qual person went back and looked at especially my earlier efforts, they'd be like, but I still look for those projects and think that they're interesting and are trying to learn more. Yeah.
Great.
So I am actually enrolled in qualitative research methods for my educational psychology master's this semester. So in like a couple of weeks, I'll have that. So that'll be a great opportunity for me to really dig into it. I have had, I've dabbled a little bit. I've never been the lead on any research project, but I've worked with other more experienced people. So I've got a handful of research projects where somebody else was kind of leading that. And so did a little bit of like thematic analysis on oh my gosh, that was a lot of work. That was so much work. I was like, holy mackerel. So under the guidance of people who know what they were doing, kind of went through that process. And that was a really, really good experience. But always with somebody else who was an expert and knew what they were doing. And I think what strikes me the most, or what kind of comes to the forefront of my mind when I was learning from other people about, qualitative research and like the differences, I think what, and this is something that, again, when I read this article, which we can talk about, but that strikes me is how kind of forthright qualitative researchers are about like, okay, here are all my biases. Here are all, and I just love that, because I think people who are more in the quantitative research world like to think that they're unbiased, right? Like that's, yeah. No, we're gonna do all these things. We're gonna eliminate bias, and it's like, no, you're not.
Right.
You're gonna try, right? You're gonna limit that as much as you can, and that's a great thing to aim for. But I love that qualitative researchers have this recognition that, like, no, there's so much bias, and let's just acknowledge and try to identify what my biases are. As the researcher, I'm involved, I'm influencing the research, and here's the context, so that, I've thought about this, and then you can have enough context so you can kind of think about this and assess it yourself. And so I love that, like hitting the bias head on.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the things that struck me most about, when I started learning about qualitative research, was that's just owning it. And I loved that. And I think that's honestly a better approach to bias. And I think quantitative researchers will probably learn a little bit from that playbook. But so that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, that's a great point. And he actually doesn't, he or she, I'm not sure what the
I
gender
don't know CF May.
but they definitely don't really talk about that quite as much in the article. So I'm glad that you kind of bring that forward. So yeah, for me, I took a qualitative research class that was a year long when I was doing my PhD in education. And it was one of those truly life altering classes for me, because my dad actually thought I was going to be a writer when I grew up, because I was like published by the time I was in like kindergarten, and that's just always what I love to do. You
haven't told that story. Wait, what? I'm sorry. We have to take a small detour here. I know that's not what this is about, but what? You were published in kindergarten. Tell us briefly about that.
So we had like this, we had this school publication for our elementary school, and you had to submit things. And I wrote a poem, and it was based off Shel Silverstein's If I Was, if I Were 1 inch tall. And so I wrote my own version of that, and it got published in our little book.
That's awesome.
So, I mean, I had these like little publications. I thought I was going to be a journalist in high school and all that kind of stuff.
Love it.
But then I kind of took a detour and ended up in veterinary medicine. And when I took this class after I went through my PhD after I went through vet school, and I was taking this class, and I was like, what? You mean I can do creative writing and it can still be research? This is amazing. Why didn't you tell me this before? Like, it was completely life-changing. And I had this fantastic professor, and we just had this really good group of people. And it was like, I discovered myself, right, through qualitative research. And so it's been a little bit of an uphill battle, because education also wants to think that it's a hard science, which it isn't. We all know it's a social science. And so that, that acceptance of the work that I do has always been a little bit of a challenge, but it's like awesome. You get to tell stories, and you get to ground it in research, and you get to acknowledge that you're biased and that you're part of the process, and just be like, yeah, this is who I am. This is how it affects me. And this is my interpretation of the world. But it truly is something that is research based. So, so I loved this article in particular, because it talked about the value that qualitative research brings to the veterinary profession, because as veterinarians, we do pride ourselves on our sort of science background. We have to do a lot of science. We have to take a lot of science. We have to think about science. We have to think about evidence and research and all of these things. But we forget that there's this other side of research, which is, and I don't want to call it a softer side. I think qualitative can be really edgy if it needs to be, but just this idea that numbers tell you one thing, and it sort of tells you the big picture thing, but the qualitative tells you the stories behind those numbers. And I think that's, the value that I find in it. And so I thought that this individual, CF May, did a really nice job of making an argument that we need to embrace that part of research and embrace that part of our profession a little bit better, because it really has the potential to make significant change within the practice. So I think one of the things
to touch on that, I think that one of the problems is that since veterinarians don't know about qualitative research, that like I'll have residents come to me and they're like, I have this research question. I'm like, okay, cool. Actually, what you want to do is a qualitative method. And they're like, wait, what now? And it just makes me wonder, like, how many research questions have we forced to be quant that wasn't the best method?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I find it, so that's a really interesting comment, because I'm sitting on a dissertation committee for a student who is a veterinarian, and she's going through the same program I went through. And she desperately wants to do this quantitative work, which, because she says it's numbers, right? It's about numbers for me. It's about numbers for me. But as I listen to what she wants to do, I keep thinking to myself, I don't think she's going to get there with the project she thinks she's going to do. Like, what the questions that she's asking and what she thinks she's going to do don't align. The questions that she's asking are qualitative questions, right? identity formation. That's qualitative work. That is qualitative all the way. So I agree with you 100% on that, Eric. And I think it's also, I think this author, and I was going to jump into that, talks about some of the barriers to veterinarians doing qualitative work. So I think you touched on one, Eric, which is just ignorance of the fact that it exists. I think you touched on another, Bobby, which is it's a lot of work. Qualitative work is, it's a lot of work in a very different way than quantitative work is. So I just wondered, what other barriers can you all maybe think about that either the author talked about or that you felt like the author maybe didn't touch on?
So two things. I just want to make sure we say the article.
Yes.
So this is from the Australian Veterinary Journal, and the title, the author is C.F. May, and it's Discovering New Areas of Veterinary Science Through Qualitative Research Interviews, Introductory Concepts for Veterinarians. We'll probably put that on the website, but yeah, just so people following along, this is the article we're talking about. Before I answer that question from you, Catherine, I just wanted to kind of throw one more thing out there, because I've got the same stories where you're like, I think this, you're trying to make this quantitative and you're really uncomfortable with this, but I want to actually even apply it more broadly to veterinary medicine, and why I think exposing veterinarians earlier in their training to the concepts of qualitative research and its importance, and it's like how it tells a different story. I can't tell you how many times a day in clinics I talk to students. We don't treat numbers, we treat patients. We get so obsessed with the numbers. And I said, if the numbers tell you one thing and the patient is telling you something else, believe your patient. Your patient is not lying to you. If they're feeling terrible and the numbers say that they're not, the numbers are wrong. If the numbers say that, hey, this animal feels terrible, no, it doesn't. Like the patient is correct. And so we don't treat the numbers, we treat the patients. And I think part of it is that reliance on the, everything is, what does the blood work tell me? What is this? What is it? And that is helpful, but it's supporting, right, the patient. Like there's that story, like what story is being told there. So I actually think there's a very everyday applicability of these concepts that a lot of veterinarians are missing out on because we get so focused on the numerical data. Yeah. And that there's data in qualitative, like that's still data. Yeah. We don't really even think about it that way. And so that's like a connection that I've made. And I think there's some parallels there. And there, I think the same reason that veterinarians are like, I want numbers. I want to be able to say this happened and then this happened and then this went by this much. We even assign numbers to categorical data all the time. And we want to turn everything into numbers. And it's, so anyway, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
No, I love that actually. And I've actually heard you say that to students. So I appreciate that connection very much.
I say it a lot.
It's important.
And now I've forgotten what your questions were.
I was just asking, there were a couple of barriers that CF May mentioned in this article to veterinarians engaging in or really considering qualitative research methods. And so you two had mentioned a couple of those, and I was just wondering if you had any others that you could think of that maybe weren't discussed in this particular article. Because I think one of the things that's pretty consistent when you talk to people, and that was brought up in this article in particular, is the idea that they're not exposed to it, which we just kind of talked about a little bit. But that, I think there's a lot more to that. So I just didn't know if you all had thoughts on that or not.
What do you think, Eric?
I think the people that go into veterinary medicine are not very philosophical, as a broad, horribly stereotypical statement. But, it really requires, I believe, a desire and an interest in philosophical ideas that do not have absolute answers. And, he does have or they have a paragraph, where they're talking about like constructivism and, the nature of reality and these kinds of things. And, that's like foundational. And the thing that makes me think of is, I've done biostats for a really, really long time now. And whenever I teach stats, I'm like, we don't know what reality is. Statistics are not going to tell you what reality is. Statistics are going to get you relatively close. But they're just going to tell you how far away you are from reality. Like you'll never know what reality is.
Yeah.
And that's not a very satisfactory answer to the students sometimes. But so yeah, I think that the desire or the interest or the understanding of philosophy, I think, is really important for qualitative research. And I just don't think that we are those people.
Okay. That hurts me a little bit. So
I mean, we are those people, right? But
when I was an undergrad, I minored in philosophy. Like, that was my backup plan. Was if vet med didn't work out, I was going to be a philosopher. So yeah, that might be part of why I ended up a little bit on this path. But yeah, that is it's an interesting perspective. Like, yeah, I want an answer. I want hard answer. Yeah. What is the, is it A or is it B? What is it? And yeah, I do think I think people in general struggle with that. I don't know that that's necessarily unique to veterinary medicine, but I think we do probably select even maybe more for that kind of preference. But I also think people can learn to get out there and to see the value in the grayness, right? In that nebulous, we don't really know. I don't know. I mean, that's one of my biases, because again, I minored in philosophy, so I love that stuff. Yeah, like that was an optional thing. I was like, I think I want to take more of these classes. And, yeah, why not? So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think the other barrier, and this is probably tied into a lot of these other things, is that people don't see the value in it. Like they see it as a soft science or not a science. This is not scientific. You can't draw conclusions from this. And so I think there's this belief or consideration that it is less than.
Yeah.
Sure. It's not as valuable, or which, I mean, I think, we all understand. No, it's you can't make a direct comparison between the two. But they are complementary, is how I think about quantitative and qualitative research. This can tell me part of the story. Quantitative can tell me part of the story, but absolutely isn't telling me the whole story. And qualitative isn't telling me the whole story either. And there are definitely, there are clearly limitations on what this can tell you, but together we get a little bit closer to answering those philosophical questions, right? But if, we're limiting ourselves quite a lot. But I do think there is that, I guess, sort of a stigma. And
thinking and building off of that value statement, listening to the Key Lime podcast, they're all human medical doctors, and they were lamenting the difficulty with P&T in qualitative research, not necessarily from the number of pubs, but from the amount of money that's involved.
Right.
Like you might get like a $5,000 or $10,000 grant to do qualitative project, whereas like your biomedical people that are doing drug studies are getting millions, right. And so like when a P&T committee looks at that, they're like, one of these things is not like the other, right? We care about money, so we're going to promote the person who's doing the
quantitative analysis of the
right, because it's a value, right? The perception of the value is the amount of money that it takes to get something done versus what the actual product does and how it impacts the world or impacts.
And it's easy, right? 1 million is bigger than 1,000. Like that's there's no mental effort that they have to put into to grading this, right? Like that's a very easy rubric to figure out. But
there's no philosophy involved, right?
So I
think that might be another barrier, is just the amount of money that's available. These kinds of things.
Yeah.
I think
the P&T process, so if you're talking about research or, researchers in university settings where, getting promotion and tenure is a big deal, if their P&T guidelines haven't been upgraded to, kind of reflect the value that qualitative research adds to our field, then that's going to be a real barrier that even if the individual is like, I value this, but I have to make smart decisions about, my career. I think that's a real thing. There's probably even more worry about that than even is actually true. At least that's, I would say, is my experience at various universities, that things are changing and that is valued. But that's a real and a genuine concern. It's a good point.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that does have to do with sort of a misperception or a misunderstanding of what qualitative research are trying to do. And I think the article does a pretty decent job of sort of summarizing that and basically saying the goal is to improve understanding of the issue under investigation rather than focus on the generalizability of the results, right? So you're looking at maybe just a pocket of, you might be looking at a single individual or a single case, but you're trying to figure out what it is about that case that you can take away from it and then potentially do a larger project or that you can apply to the next time you have that case. Whereas, when you're looking at these large databases or even moderately large databases, all you really want to do is figure out what the average is. And the interesting thing to me about that is that the average person actually doesn't actually exist, right? It's just this like the conglomeration of thousands and thousands and thousands of other people who are somewhat similar, and then it spits out this average. And
those
so,
other people even exist. I mean,
yeah, exactly, right? 9 out of 10 dentists say, yeah. And so I think going back to your point, Eric, about biostatistics and how it's like there's this sort of quest in quantitative research to find big T truth, right? Like this universal response or answer or law or something. And qualitative sort of recognizes that that probably doesn't actually really exist. And I find it really interesting because, so I tell people that the only math classes I ever got A's in college were biostatistics and statistics, and biostatistics is like BS. And to me, that's really what statistics is, right? Because people are, oh, numbers don't lie. I'm like, well, numbers don't lie, but the people who are manipulating the numbers certainly are biased and are going to manipulate them. And I mean, like, how is it possible to say, oh, well, if you have less than 40, then you can use a Z-score and that represents more than 40, and therefore you can generalize these results. And you're like, who the heck came up with that and proved it, right? So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There's like this idea that there's this big T truth out there, but in reality, none of us really know what it is. And so
I actually this morning on clinics was having to explain to, or not explain, but like discuss with some students and interns and young doctors this concept in quantitative research where they're like, it's trending towards significance. It's one of my favorite things. What's least favorite things, but I was just like,
yeah,
if they say it's trending towards significant, that is a synonym for it was not significant.
Right.
And then exactly. Like, I was like, let me draw out like, here's the numbers. This means if there were 3 in each group, and in one group you had 1 that, had the result you wanted and 2 that didn't. And then the other group, it was flip-flop, 2 that had the result you wanted, 1 didn't. Would you be convinced by that data? And they were like, no. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
But if you have 100, in each group and those numbers, pan out, then you'd be like, okay, yeah, now I'm convinced. So somebody can look at that and say 3 and 3 and say, but it's trending towards significance, which means that if this proportion holds up in a larger group, then it would be significant, but right. It didn't in this group. And I was like, it's just not significant, and I see that so much in so many papers that come out. And it happens a lot in vet med because a lot of our numbers are small for quantitative research studies. And so they're like, well, it was trending towards significance. I'm like, yes. So it wasn't significant. That's what you've proven. And so, yes, when it comes to manipulating, we get really upset when the numbers don't tell the story we want to. And so we try to figure out different ways to do it. But so I crack up about that.
Yeah, I should have probably used that phrase when I was an undergraduate and I was, bouncing checks. But my bank account is trending towards having the money in there. It's just not quite there yet. Just hang in there with me.
Yeah, if I just keep adding, eventually it will
eventually get there. I mean, just give me a break, right? So so it is funny to me that people try to say, that numbers don't lie and that numbers tell you these things and they tell you these truths, and really they really don't tell you anything. They just give you a snapshot of something that you are interested in at any given time. So one of the comments that CFMA makes in this article, in this paragraph later, is that in contrast to quantitative research, qualitative approaches do not usually have a predetermined sample size. And so I was curious about if you all thought any more about that particular sentence, because I certainly did and had some quibbles with it. So I don't know if you all do or not.
I guess how when I was reading that, people get really stuck on power analyses in quantitative studies, like with writing grants and things like that. They always want you to do a power analysis, which I remember when I was learning about running a power analysis, I'm like, wait, you have to already know what it's like the numbers you have to like either make up or, you're just, I've decided that this is the amount that, so the power analysis is not the like, that people want it to be anyway. But that's kind of where I went when I read that, I suppose. They were just trying to like, you're not going to be able to show some sort of statistical significance with your sample size. Yeah. But yeah, now I'm curious what I don't want to hear what your quibble is.
I'd be very curious too, because I remember reading about this, like, ways that you can establish an a priori, sample for qualitative studies and that kind of thing. I think that my perspective is it comes down to your research question, because your research question might be an N of 1, Like if your research question is like, I want to like understand the life of Henrietta Lacks, or whatever it is, like that, then that's, that's your sample size. I think that, what the author goes on to kind of explain is the saturation point.
Yeah.
And I think that the most successful projects that I've done for Qual have been like continuously evaluated, right? Like we do an interview, we look at that data, we do another, we look at that data, like we do it continuously until we reach that saturation point.
Yeah.
Like those are the ones where I have the most confidence, I guess, where I'm like, okay, we got the data that we not wanted.
Yeah.
Or that we're going to get. Yeah, this is as good as.
Or that we're going to get. Fair. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think the article did a nice job of that. I think my quibble is that that there are times when you go into, at least for me, when I go into qualitative research projects where and maybe this is because I'm an experienced researcher, where I think, okay, this is the question, as Eric pointed out, this is the question I'm interested in. What is it? What sort of population? How many stories do I need to sort of think about getting before I think I'll be at that point? And that doesn't mean that I'm going to go in and say, I have to have 10 stories or else this isn't going to work, because you might say I need 10, and then at 8 you realize you've got all the information that you need. You've got saturation, you've got triangulation, you've got crystallization, but you always sort of have in your head an idea, at least, of where you want to go and how many people you want to talk about. And some of that depends on your question, and some of that depends on the approach. So, I mean, obviously, if you're doing a case study, you have a predetermined sample size, right? It's going to be one. If you're interested in exploring a concept that maybe nobody else has explored, it may take you a little bit more. But so I think it was just the way it was written that it was this way. Like, gotcha. In contrast to qualitative never has.
You never has that, yeah.
Predetermined sample size. And so I think that that was my quibble. But I will say that the following paragraph then, the author talks about the flexibility of sampling for qualitative research, which can be a challenge to people. And I think something that you referred to, Eric, is sort of the reflexivity of it and sort of the cyclical process of research. So when I think of qualitative research, I think of a circle, with arrows at different points that just sort of keep going. And then at some point it stops because you've reached that point where you've got what you need. Whereas for me, quantitative research is very much just parallel lines, right? It's a linear process. You start here, you go here, you go here, you go here, you end. If you don't get the result you want, you go back to the beginning. You start here, you go here, you go here, you go here, you end. And so I think of parallel lines when I think of quantitative research, and I think of circles when I think of qualitative research. And I think that's a real challenge personally, when I talk to people, that there is so much flexibility in the process. And there's so many things you have to do simultaneously in qualitative research that you're not doing in quantitative research. So it was just interesting that they said that in that one paragraph, and then the next sentence was like, but there's all this flexibility and and that kind of thing.
Well, I think maybe what could be or could have been emphasized more was kind of getting back to the original, like, qualitative researchers are generally really good at saying, here are my biases, but also like, here's here's why this is the sample. This was a convenient sample. This was who was available. These are the people who responded. This was, how many, we tried to get a focus group and it was everybody who was willing to participate. That's what we did. So, and it's acknowledging, like, this was what we got. This, the sample was from this because that's who was available. So I think it's a very honest, sure. Many times does that happen in qualitative research where it's like, yeah, this is what we could afford. But that's not what you publish typically, right? You're going to like, oh, we did a power analysis and it was powered to, we make it seem like, oh, everything was by the number. No, it wasn't. You did what you could afford to do.
Ooh, there was a hashtag overly honest methods a few years ago. That's what this reminds me of. Like, we spun it at 3,600 RPM because it made a scary noise when it went faster.
Great.
Oh God, I know this. I have to go back and look at this. It's what it's called. What it's some kind of honest research method?
Overly honest research methods, I think.
That's awesome.
You can look for that. I think that sounds like it was written by a qualitative researcher.
It kind of does, actually.
Right? It's just like, here's all the things. This is what well, this is what didn't. And but because maybe like they're better writers, it sounds nicer.
Maybe,
like not better writers is the right way to say it, but like more entertaining writers. I always like reading this, like it's like reading stories. It is stories a lot of the time. But there's value in that, and we can learn a lot about ourselves. And cool.
Definitely.
So
so one last thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to you all to see what you wanted to talk about with this article. I think that the author did an adequate job of bringing up the concept that the language of qualitative research is very different than the language of quantitative research. I feel like that could have been done a little bit better and probably emphasized a little bit more, but I think in general, for a beginner, this was a really good introduction. Because I think I know that one of the things I run into when I'm, say, reviewing a paper that says that it's a qualitative paper is, we did this thematic analysis and we discovered X theme that occurred in 14 of the 20. And I'm like, okay, you've just quantified your qualitative research, right? And I'm not saying that numbers aren't important in qualitative research or that they should never be used, but they're used differently than they're used in quantitative research. And so I think this idea of validity and reliability and inter-rater reliability and, all those things that people want to do and say because that's how we've been trained, it's, I think, another barrier to some people doing qualitative research because they don't understand there's a whole nother language and they don't understand how to use that or what it even means sometimes. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And it's something that I still struggle with, honestly, in that, because you spend so much time, kind of being trained in one way that it is easy to want to put numbers to things. And not, like you said, not that that's always bad, but it is a different approach. But one thing I will kind of address that I think, for me at least, was pretty well explained in this article for thinking about who the intended audience is, was the section on quality criteria, where they were talking about here's the different ways to assess the quality of quantitative versus qualitative research. And I thought that was a helpful way to approach it with people who are like, this is where you're from, this is the language that you understand here. It's not quite the same, but let me explain it to you in a way that kind of puts it in context. So I thought that was a nice way, like one specific part of the language, maybe not in writing the article, but at least in understanding how to assess it. I thought that was nice. So more of that could have been probably useful in the sense of just the approach to the research and the writing and conveying the message. But
agreed.
Thinking about the numbers crossover, I suppose this is one reason why when I've done qual stuff, I dislike doing coding, because it's so hard to disambiguate this showed up this many times, and so like it's got to be a meaningful theme. We just did a faculty retreat and we had a bunch of like Mentimeter questions that the people were responding to while we were giving our little presentation, and so we looked at that data, and I basically did like a really simple thematic, qual analysis of it. And as I was doing so, I'm like, I am absolutely bringing my bias to which ones I think are worthwhile to carry through, right? But that's also part of the process, right? That's not a flaw in the system. That is a feature.
Yeah. There have definitely been times when I was doing qualitative analyses of things, and there would be like one statement, and I'm like, this has not been brought forward in any other statement, but wow, this is really powerful. Like, this is really important. And this is something that maybe I could potentially do a case study on later, or find out and do interviews with other people to see if this is truly an anomaly, or if this is just, if
he articulated it in a really good way. Yeah.
Or if I just missed it somehow or something like that. So yeah, I think it is something that is difficult to kind of wrap your brain around sometimes, that numbers don't necessarily mean everything in qualitative, but I certainly am guilty of that, right? Like I have 400 pages of transcripts, and out of that 400 pages, this one particular thing shows up on 200 pages of it. So that must mean that it's really important. I mean, it just that's how our brains are.
That might, right? Like if it's coming up, there probably is something to that. But I think we've all also probably just in life experienced somebody says something in a way that just like captures the essence of something, and like you're like, yes, that thing that resonates with me. And why has nobody else said it in that way that really makes so much sense? And it can be really powerful. And so finding a way to articulate some of those, emotions, those feelings, those things, I feel like English is actually very limited in some of that. I love when you hear like other languages and you're like, we have this word that means this whole thing that takes a paragraph in English to explain it. It's so cool, and so I feel like every once in a while you come across something that just captures the essence of something that you weren't able to put into words. And those types of things, I think everybody can relate to that, right? Like you've had that experience where like, boom, it's just one thing, but man, it resonates really nicely. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the things that I like when I'm reading qualitative studies as well, to be like, ooh, yeah, this one sentence captured like the essence of this whole thing sometimes. And I really like that about it. And it doesn't have to, just one person said it, but I'm like, if you read that to everybody, they'd be like, yes, that.
For sure. So yeah, I think the only other thing I wanted to point out is I think this author did a really nice job. I mean, I had to read the sentence a couple of times, but sort of talking about method versus methodology in qualitative research. And it was one of those moments where you're like, oh, they did a really nice job of explaining this in a way that I haven't really been able to figure out how to explain. And so I thought it was just a really nice paragraph. I'm trying to find it because I
had to read that like a couple times too, because I was like, okay, yeah, but let me, how do I wrap my brain around that? And then could I explain that to somebody else?
Right.
That's what I was trying to do.
The Key Limers had a really good episode where they talked about methodologies, paradigms, a couple other like very interrelated concepps that I honestly didn't fully understand. Like even when after I listened to it, I'm like, I need to listen to that again. It's one of those kinds of things that for me, it's a very slippery concept that I just need to like come back to a bunch of times.
Yeah, and it is still for me as well. And so I have actually evolved into using the term qualitative approach, because I think one of the things that really can be very confusing about qualitative methods is that your method can actually also be your theory, right? So like I'm a discourse analyst and I can use that as a method. I can use that as a theory behind my method or for using my method, or I can use them both together. And that's, and I think that's really hard sometimes because it's such an abstract concept, whereas quantitative tends to be a little bit more compartmentalized and there's a specific ascribed sort of definition to everything that you do. So I felt like this, I found the paragraph, and it basically just says, it's important to distinguish between methods and methodology, acknowledges that those cause confusion. And then qualitative methods are informed by methodology, which refers to the process whereby the design of the research and the choice of particular methods are justified in relation to the research project. And then including the philosophical and theoretical positions informing the research, which I thought was, I was really glad that was included. They didn't actually explore that any further, which, just based on the amount of space they had, it's not surprising. I would love to see something following up and sort of exploring that a little bit more. But then it's this last sentence that really gets to you, right? It's like, it's the philosophical and theoretical differences that account for the divergence between qualitative and quantitative research and their ability to answer different types of research questions. And I think that's a really great sort of high impact statement, right? So I think I really actually enjoyed this article. I think it's a really good entry-level article that kind of sort of digs down into the heart of the reasons behind it and doesn't overload you with a whole bunch of things that could potentially be like, holy crap, I have no idea what that means. So I felt like it was really easy to sort of grasp and understand, even if I didn't have sort of a grounding in it. I don't know how you all felt about it, but.
I agree. A couple of things I really liked. One, this is not in an education specific journal or, like this is like, it's a regular journal that regular veterinarians are going to be reading. And so I'm excited to see an article like this trying to reach, I mean, that's who it was for, right? The intended audience is people who aren't familiar with qualitative research. And so I really liked that. I liked that it was a primer, right? Like it was manageable. And there were times when same thing, like, do I want him to go into more? It's like, it was a good call because you might have lost some people right there if you start waxing poetic on methodology versus method, we don't want to lose people before they finish this. And so I thought that was good. The one, critique, it's not even a critique. The one like wish I had for this, I think was, I would have liked to have seen more use or kind of practical examples. There were a couple kind of in like the tables and things, but I think it would be nice for people who are still kind of wary about this to give them like, here's, you know, kind of like the examples we've already been saying, like somebody who is trying to use quantitative research when that's not appropriate. Like it would have been nice to say, here's some examples of where this is the methodology, or, you know, this is the approach that you should be using, or this is the time when
That is really a cool idea.
qualitative research would have been more useful, because I think that would make it more concrete in people's, oh, okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. This was the one thing I was hoping for more of. And again, there were glimmers of it in some of the examples, but I would have wanted a little more explicit, like, hey, here you go. You're the audience. You know how you're thinking about this? Here's, you know, anyway, so that was my one wish. Not really a critique so much, but
Very
yeah.
cool. Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. It seemed very approachable, which was nice. It was definitely written at a good level. I really like table 6 because I like checklists. So it's you know, the key questions to ask when reading qualitative research, and it's, you know, more or less a bunch of yes no questions. And I think that that's a really handy resource for the reader. In terms of, you know, things that could be improved, it ended a little, I don't know if I'd say abruptly, but I kind of like thought there were going to be a couple more sections to this. I don't know exactly what those would be necessarily, but you know, I think for the length and for the, you know, keeping the reader's interest, probably keeping it short and punchy was better than long and exhaustive.
Yeah.
And I actually liked a lot of the different tables to kind of like simplify things, like boom, manageable chunks was nice.
Yeah. And I think you always risk sort of simplifying it too much when you do that, but I felt like those tables were pretty good, right? Like they struck a nice balance between being too simple, not being too simple, but not being so complicated that people are like, you know, I can't do this. This is ridiculous.
But I was also like, you know who your intended audience is. That's how I felt about like this was, I felt like it was very strategic. Maybe it was, I don't know, but it felt very strategic. Like, okay, this is getting kind of wordy and flowery and people might be getting uncomfortable. Let me throw a table at you. I don't know. But I found it helpful. Like I was like, oh yeah, I like that. I do. At least when I'm reading, sometimes it's nice to break things up a little bit too. And to here's an example. So yeah, I don't know, maybe reading too much into that. But.
For sure.
And something that you said earlier, Catherine, that I wanted to just elaborate on was you were talking about the potential interrelationship between qualitative and quantitative research. And I think is a good example from something that we did where we were wanting to look at students' motivations for if they wanted to do go into an internship or go into private practice when they graduated. And so we did an interview means end method where we kept asking them why, basically like kind of get a core values. And then when we got that, I didn't have this theory at the outset, but when I got it, I looked at it like, oh my gosh, these fall along self-determination theory lines. And so then we classified it according to that. And then we had like a bunch of groupings within that, like, okay, like this is this part of autonomy and self-determination theory. Like I want control over my patients or whatever it is. So that was the qualitative work that we did. And we did, I don't know, like 12 or 15 interviews with students, and then took that and designed a survey that asked about those elements that we had previously identified as being, you know, core values, basically, and then push that out to a larger sample to get that data, right? To get representative data that's generalizable. So, I'm gonna pat myself on the back for that one. I was really impressed with how that went down, frankly. I was like, oh, this worked really well. I didn't have that vision in mind when I started, but it seems like it was a really nice marriage of those two approaches.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a beautiful example of one of the ways that you can really use qualitative research to sort of launch a bigger, you know, more generalizable research project. But I think the opposite is true as well, right? So if you're going through your quantitative large study and you find this outlier, the qualitative gives you the opportunity to go and explore why that outlier is an outlier. Is it truly an outlier, or is it just something that was flawed in the methodology, or were the questions asked in a way that created this opportunity for somebody to demonstrate something that was unique? And so I think that's really important to keep in mind, that as Bobby said, qualitative and quantitative work hand in hand, right? They're not butting heads. They're working hand in hand in a way that really enhance each other. And so, yeah, I think that's a great illustration of going sort of from a small to launching a bigger project that bore fruit, but you can, I think, go the other direction as well.
Yeah, if I would pare it down, I mean, the qualitative is getting at the why.
Absolutely.
Right. And the what, but why? And that, I mean, I don't know. I find that always the most important question for all things, right? Is why? Why is this happening the way it is? And not that you can never answer that question qualitatively or quantitatively, but I think it's challenging. And so, yeah, if your question is why, I think that's where you need to start. If your research question starts with why, you probably need to be thinking about qualitative, approach as an option. But
yeah, definitely.
That's my very simplified.
There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. So, yeah, I don't know if you all have other conversations that you wanted to bring up based on this paper, or if there was anything else you wanted to sort of offshoot for the last few minutes that we have tonight. But I appreciate the conversation and the willingness to engage in it, because I think we're seeing an increasing number of people who are appreciating the value of qualitative research, which makes me so happy, for sure, especially in veterinary medicine. But I still think there is some pushback on it. So
yeah, no, from the time that you chose the article to now, I actually had a scenario with some colleagues, and they approached me and they're like, hey, we want to do this study. We have some questions we want to answer. And so I'm like, okay. And they're telling me the questions. I'm like, okay, well, this sounds very qualitative. And I think what we're probably going to need to do is X, Y, and Z. And we're talking through it. And they were just like not happy with this, and they're like, but what if we did like pre-post, or like, but how are we going to be able to show like the change? We want to be able to show the change. And I was like, but that's not the questions you were asking. That's you, from what you said, this was the approach that I'm going to recommend. And and I was like, well, I mean, we could do a survey, like we could change, but we've got to change the questions.
Right.
Because the questions you're asking will not be answered with a survey. Like that is not what you're talking about. And so I was like, well, we could do this and try to, give them some examples of if we ask questions like this, and we could do Likert scales and stuff like that. And they were like, okay, yeah, we're feeling okay with this. And so I'm like, we're having like a Zoom meeting, and they're friends, right? And so at some point I was like, I'm just going to pause for a second. I got to say this. I'm like, y'all just aren't comfortable with qualitative research. That's really what this comes down to. And they were both like, well, yeah. And I was like, so and that's okay. Like we can move past this, but I'm like, really, this just comes down to the fact that what you guys are asking for this and you don't like that. So let's make things a little bit, but yeah, I'm like, now I should just send them the article and be like, hey, read this.
Well, I mean, I think the thing about it is
podcast.
That qualitative is touchy-feely, right? And some of us don't want to do touchy-feely. I was pretty resistant to the touchy-feely part of it. I mean, numbers are easy to sort of, you depersonalize yourself from it, you distance yourself from it, it's fine. But I think the other thing, and I don't know if your friends know this or not, but the other thing that people find out is qualitative research is really hard. I mean, like the amount of and the volume of data that you get is huge. Even if you're doing a case study on one case or one person, you do one interview. I mean, 45 minutes of interview is a significant amount of data. And then you have to go through it multiple times, and you have to, make sure that you're getting out of it what you think you're getting out of it. And then you have to acknowledge that you're interpreting it based on your own perspectives and your own ideas about things. And like, it's not just like labor and labor intensive and laborious, but it's also like internally, so you have to self-reflect, and you have to like put a part of yourself into it. And I think that for people who think that educational research is easy, they don't understand, and whether it's qualitative or quantitative, but I think more on the qualitative side, they don't understand the labor. And
not gonna lie, part of me was relieved.
I mean,
it's so much less work for me.
Right. Yeah.
Much like orders of magnitude different in the amount of hours I was going to have to put into this. And so when they went that, I maybe that's selfishly why I didn't push back quite as much as maybe I should have. But I was like, no, we can do surveys. That's okay. This one, I just saved myself like 6 weeks worth of work. So
yeah, I mean,
for our listeners who are academics, minions.
Yes, yes.
No,
Well,
they
I mean, the other,
provide minions, but they're not going to be minions who are yeah. Anyway.
yeah. I mean, I just, so we just I had a group of 7 researchers, and 6 of us were actually involved with this particular paper before, when we were doing the data analysis and collection, and it just got published in JAMA about the veterinary technicians, and sort of, it was a qualitative research paper. We had 34 interviews.
Ooh.
And so whenever I talk to people and I'm like, well, we had 34 interviews, you can tell whether they're qualitative or quantitative right away.
Yeah.
Because the quantitative people are like, oh gosh, well, that's not a very good sample size. And the qualitative people are like, holy crap, you did
That's so
34.
Yeah, where they're like, but there are thousands of technicians in, like
Yeah.
34.
I'm like, but 34 is a lot. So
No, that's
it's a really nice litmus test for people to tell me pretty quickly whether they're quant or qual.
Yeah.
I think the one kind of conclusion takeaway that I would add is, when we're thinking about educational research, that a lot of the times the questions that we want answered are better suited to qual and methods. And that I think especially JVME has gotten really good about finding reviewers who are competent and being open to those papers, whereas certainly discipline journals have a hard time understanding qual research a lot of the times, in my experience. And even, I don't know, probably 10, 12 years ago, JVME was also had a hard time just finding reviewers. So it's nice that seems like in the veterinary education space, a perfectly viable, well accepted way to do data collection and publications.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, and the fact that, we just got a qualitative paper accepted at JAVMA, right? Like, that wasn't going to happen 10 or 15 years ago, probably. So, and we can have a conversation about that whole review process later, but the fact of the matter is that it got accepted and it got published. And that's really what it comes down to, is that it's important that work gets out there. So it is, I am very pleased to see sort of the change and the acceptance. And
so you've got that in JAVMA. Again, this article is not in an education specific journal, a qualitative specific journal. So it's creeping out there, and it'll take a while before, it becomes well integrated right into the collective psyche. But it's like you say, it's very different than 10 or 15 years ago, I'd have been like, huh?
Yeah.
Me personally was not there at all either, and it did take a while for me to wrap my brain around a lot of this stuff, and I'm still grappling with some of it, right?
Oh yeah.
What do you mean the introduction is the longest part of the paper?
Yeah. What do you mean that I can't stick to a 1,500 word limit?
Yeah. Like it's so funny, all of the things, like how it gets flipped and that, I just thought of another barrier that wasn't mentioned in the article, but sometimes just the language, right? And this is more specific to education research but it's probably true of a lot of disciplines, right? If you don't know the theories, like Eric, you mentioned self-determination theory. A couple years ago, I would be like, I don't know what that is. Now I can Google it, obviously, but if I don't know what to Google, right? Like if I'm trying to come up with some of these things and I don't even know the words to use, that's something I had struggled with a lot. I still do to some degree. I'm getting certainly better with it. But I'm like, here's the concept, but I don't know the words that are consistently used. And so I search for the wrong things. And then somebody's like, oh, use this. And I'm like, oh my God, there it all is. So there is a challenge in that if you're trying to break into, or even just, trying to find articles to read from that, it might be hard for people. And so I think that can be a barrier as well.
Yeah, and I would say even understanding the reason that theory has to be incorporated, right? So like if you don't understand the foundational reason that theory has to be incorporated into a research paper, which you don't do in a quantitative paper, then unless it's a theoretical physics paper, something like that, obviously, it's very different. So yeah, I agree.
But it'd be like having a quantitative paper without a hypothesis.
Right. Right. But people don't really understand that. And they try to still fit it into this whole little.
This is just what happened.
Right. Yeah. Like there's still this box of you need to put your introduction, you need to put your methods, you need to put your this, and your
results, and then your discussion. And then
and it's like, well, but that's not really how qualitative work always works. Sometimes you can do that. And sometimes you just can't. So yeah, it's just a different way of thinking about things. And a lot of that's just the way we're trained and the way that we're taught. So
yeah, people can be trained with the other stuff for sure. Yeah, and papers like this are absolutely the way to help that get out there more, which I think is important. So it's awesome. Yeah, I'm glad you picked this one.
Well, thanks. I'm glad I tried to pick one that wasn't terribly long and terribly,
it was a good one.
Convoluted, because that could have just been crazy. But
we'll save that for later.
Yeah, I feel like it was a pretty good introduction.
It was good discussion point too, because I think a lot of our listeners, maybe don't know a whole lot about qualitative research. And since it is coming out more in veterinary education, just, a little bit of a primer is probably helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for reading it and having some interest and being willing to have the conversation.
Absolutely. It's good to catch up with you both again, as always.
Yes.
Yeah. So here we go. What number are we on? What episode of Rive?
This was 6.
Episode 6 of Rive. Well, thanks for listening. And we'll catch you guys all next time.